Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Transgender Show. I'm your host, Emily. We are excited to be partnering with TransPride Pittsburgh Health and Wellness Conference this year. We will be featuring several of the creators of the event here on the Transgender Show over the next coming months leading up to the event. First up is Alison Simpson. Dreamer, thinker, singer, writer, trans woman, and advocate for the community. Alison is the co-chair, key planner and organizer, and a course director for the event. Everyone, please welcome to the show, Alison. Hi, love. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Whatever I have going on during the day, show night always wipes it away and makes it great. So
awesome.
That means I am great now. Everybody in the audience, how are you tonight? I see we've got a lot of people that are still here from Jay's show. It's always wonderful to have you all here. Let's go ahead and jump in. Just a quick reminder for everybody that you can ask any question of our guest or make any comments that you'd like. We will get to those after our break. We run through a section of the gender journey story for Alison and to take a break. After that, we come back, answer all of your questions. I will pass along any comments you have, and we'll talk about everything outside of her journey. So yeah, if anything you ask, we will get to, and if we're not getting to it, just know that it will be answered after that break. You have a very interesting gender journey, and we have so much to talk about, so we need to jump into it and get moving fast. Your journey started with a physical journey where you had to change countries. I'd like to start first, before we dive into that too deeply. What was going on what was the situation when you realized that you were trans and were forced to kind of come to grips with that?
Well, technically my journey begins many years before, but it was at a time when we didn't even have this kind of language. The term transgender did not exist. So it wasn't until about the age of 20, when I was in university, that I actually sort of came out to myself and said, this is who I am, and this is who I'm going to be, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. And that was when I came out to other people for the first time and tried to seek care. And it became quickly apparent that the care that I needed, which I knew about from the nascent internet, which basically saved my life, was not available to me. We went to our family doctor and said, hey, this is happening. We need some help. And she basically said, I have no idea what to do here, which is not that uncommon today, but far less so. And they eventually found a sexologist to talk to me. And his first conversation was basically, oh, yeah, we don't do that anymore. We spoke once more, in which I basically said that I was going to transition and for him to go to hell, and then I left. I spent about a year sort of just pulling myself together, figuring things out. I'd come out to my grandmother and my mother at that point, in that order, and they were willing to provide some funds so that I could go to the US and, seek care, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up in South Africa during the apartheid era. And so it was kind of a big change. But what you have to understand is that at that point in my life, I no longer really felt connected to the place I was born, the society I lived with, even my own family. I literally felt like there was no place for me there. So I had nothing to lose. And 3 days after I turned 21, I got on to an international flight by myself for the first time, and I was in Miami the next morning.
Wow, that's a big, bold step. What sort of a safety net did you have to catch you there in a new country? You talked about having a little bit of sort of a nest egg that your mother and grandmother helped you with. Did you have anything else, any contacts or anybody to lean on here in the States?
So yes, one of the factors in my own coming out was the birth of the internet. It became publicly accessible to students around the US in sort of mid-91, I believe. And for me, it was March of 1992. And I had been able to sort of come out of my shell, so to speak, online in those early online communities, and eventually came out to somebody. And through various means, I went onto what we called IRC, Internet Relay Chat, and there was a community there called Transgen at the time. And so through that community, I learned everything about trans care, at least modern trans care, and what was necessary, what was available. But at the same time, I made all of these friends at universities throughout the US. And I was closer to them than anybody that, I lived with or knew in person. So those were the folks that I went out to visit and to sort of be with and try to figure things out. I will say that I did have an uncle who lived in Miami, well, actually, technically Fort Lauderdale. And that's why I started my journey there. And I spent the night there. But, after 6 hours, because we got in very, very late, and the shuttle could not find them. They were on one of the canals, and they just literally could not find the address until, I don't know, in the morning. But I slept there, got on a Greyhound bus, and I was in North Central Florida later that evening. And I proceeded to sort of spend time in various locations, all university-based, move on to another location, move on to yet another location. And I basically did a tour through the southern U.S., up through Texas, off to Colorado, and then ultimately up to Wisconsin briefly before tracing my route back. And I didn't really have a lot of plans. I simply, I knew people, some of whom knew my story. Well, actually, at that point, I think everybody did. But I wasn't what you would call transitioned at that point. I've sort of been a nascent, non-gendered state myself. And that's how I traveled, hoping to, ultimately settle somewhere and engage with a therapist and get the journey started.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so you're essentially just couch surfing at this point, correct?
Pretty much. I did happen to live in the dorms at the University of North Texas for a few weeks. It was a week before they realized I didn't go there. And I had a very sort of come to God moment with their RA, but I was there for a couple of weeks. I went back there afterwards to see the kids there graduate. I was planning on spending time staying with a friend in Louisiana, which was like, I think, my second or third stop. And when I did go back there on my sort of return arc, she was having a crisis. And so I ended up not being able to stay. And at that point, I had nowhere else to go. But my friends in Gainesville, Florida said, come live with us for a while you figure things out. I ended up living on their couch for 7 months.
Wow. So you come out here to transition, and you've got your network, you have your friends, you've got your support system. We'll get into kind of what level of exploration you were able to do at that point of your journey in a second. But what were your first steps, and when were you actually able to take steps towards actual gender care?
So, getting out there, I guess, at the beginning of April, it wasn't until the summer when actually my mother and grandmother back on the other side of the world had found a gender therapist in Central Florida. So they flew out and we all went together. So this is probably July. And back then, we were under a much older version of the standards of care. They did a full comprehensive evaluation. It involved IQ tests, math tests, personality tests. And ultimately, they got the diagnosis that I was transgender. And I think up until that moment, my mother had been hoping against hope that she was very supportive, but I think she really hoped that it was something else, But it became very real to them. And that night she actually called my dad, and that he was the third person to find out. We really just weren't comfortable telling the rest of the family because I grew up in a society not unlike small town or rural America where, it's fairly conservative. And every indication I'd been given was this was not something that you could do.
Were you able to, in the therapy sessions or before or since, have the conversation with your mom and perhaps your grandmother to understand why they were so quick to support you and help you in this way?
Well, they loved me. They were the two people in the world who I was closest to. I actually came out to my grandmother first because I wasn't sure that I could do it with my mom. And she responded by saying, "Oh, I'm so sad. I wish you told us sooner." Um, which, it was pretty special. My mom, the first words she told me, it was a very emotional time. We were in a car. I was preparing to do a driving test, which I never did, by the way. But I sort of broke down, and I came out to her there. And her first words were, "I will support you no matter what." But I will say, I think deep down she was hoping for a different outcome, because this is a big deal for any parent.
Yeah.
But we proceeded after that. My mom had never been to the US. My grandmother had been a couple of times. So we went on tour. So I got to spend a fair amount of time with them, crisscrossing the US. We were probably on 20 plane flights during the next couple of weeks until returning to Florida. And then they went home, and I continued to work with that therapist.
Wow. That that is a level of support that I haven't come across yet in the show. I know we've had some people that just sort of outright support their kids, and that's wonderful. But to then do the research to find the therapist for the child and fly halfway across the world to be there for the sessions and to help that way, and then just on top of it, just to go exploring the United States a bit, that is so wonderful. What were some of the key things that came out of the sessions with your mom there? I mean, you said that she was hoping sort of deep in her heart that there would be something else that could explain or fix this in a way. But what were some other things that came out of that? Was there anything that was really moving for you?
Well, they were only really there for that evaluation. And then we left, and then we came back. So they weren't there for the actual sessions, but most of that evaluation was done by other people while they talked to the therapist. And then we all met up afterwards for that. Not a lot came out of that, except, there were some questions. And one of the questions she asked me is, "What happens if you fall for a woman?" And I said, "Then I fall for a woman. What's the big deal?" But to her, it was something that she hadn't thought through those things yet.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, even though I had that level of support, which was great, once they flew back, I was pretty much on my own, and essentially trying to rebuild my life while moving forward with gender care. And so I would see the therapist regularly. The problem was, international finance is tricky, and the exchange rate was not great. They had arranged, or we had arranged, for me to actually go back to school, because I had to drop out of university in order to do this. And I decided I didn't want to be on that career path anyway, so that was just gone. So I went, or tried to go to community college. I got my own apartment, which was kind of distraught because I found another community member who I knew from online. He came out, and we got an apartment together. And then a few hours after signing the lease, he freaked out and called his mom, and I never saw him again. So I was left sort of with this huge amount of money, if you take international finance into consideration, trying to attend community college, which was also having to be paid for from another country, while living alone on the other side of town from all my friends, and basically relying on buses to get anywhere. It didn't work out so well. So a lot of our sessions were really just about me trying to, put on a brave face and survive. There's an end to this story. So that continued into the next year. And around late March, this would have been 1994 at this point, I got a letter in the mail. Now, I would continue to live in a sort of a gender neutral phase. There'd been cross-dressing in my past as I was sort of dealing with this growing up, and that was not something I wanted to do anymore. It was like, I'm all in or I'm not in. And so I spent those 2 years sort of letting go of everything that had come before. And I get this letter in the mail that says, we've changed our minds. We've decided you're not trans anymore. You're actually bipolar, and we don't want to see you anymore. And I transitioned right then and there, and I've never looked back.
Wow. That's a hell of a left turn on the diagnosis there.
It is. That's highly unprofessional. But that wasn't something I could pursue. I was working with a counselor at the community college who had a bipolar son, and he's like, "No, you're not. You're definitely not." So that helped. I did go back to South Africa briefly to figure out what the hell was going to happen next. And actually, the plan was for me to move back. They'd found somebody who was confident and competent. The biggest issue being that for many years, transition had been, you could just do it. There were no laws against it, but they'd actually made a law where transition, at least legal transition, was no longer allowed. So that was a barrier. But at least this person could fulfill the promise the other therapist hadn't and get me started on hormones, which is one of the first things most trans people that plan a medical transition are sort of waiting on so that they can get moving. I had to transition without initially. So I went back there for a while, and I sort of came back to the US to settle things. And part of that settling was after a few months sort of closing up shop in that apartment, I went on another bus tour of the US. This time visiting all of my trans friends, because the first time around, most of the people I knew, in fact, all of the people were not trans because there just weren't that many of us in that age range that were out or could find each other back then.
So the first tour, when you're doing all the couch surfing, those weren't trans folks. Those were just people that you had met online that were at universities.
And some of them were faculty or worked in tech for the universities. But yeah, I was the first trans person they'd ever met.
And so what were some of the key highlights of the bus tour? Now you're finally with people like you, and you've made your decision that I'm ready to do this 100%. You've got your doctor lined up, and HRTs just waiting in the wings. So what did that change for you as you embarked on this tour?
I kind of left in a hurry because there were things that were going on beyond my control, and I just had to pack up everything. I sent some of it down to my uncle in Miami, and the rest I carried with me. And there was sort of a plan. I was going to go to Wisconsin to stay with somebody, a mutual friend, and I was actually going to visit somebody who was having surgery in northern Wisconsin while I was there, and then work my way sort of west and eventually end up in California. And so when I went to Wisconsin, now, I'm full-time at this point. That was the terminology we used back then. I'm presenting myself as a female to the rest of the world. And I was nervous, but also, pretty confident this is me. So whatever happens, this is me. And I didn't really run into any problems, which was a bit of a surprise for me. I ended up going to Neenah, Wisconsin, which is where one of the 4 surgeons who was doing good work in gender affirming surgery in the, North America at the time was located. And I ended up spending a couple of nights in the wards, helping out my friend and basically everybody else who was there. And one of those folks who was a little bit ahead, they'd had surgery earlier, was leaving the hospital the day that I was, going to be heading back to my friend. And I helped to escort them to their hotel room, and they gave me their hormones. And that's how I started HRT.
Wow. That's so awesome.
I remember very vividly calling my therapist in South Africa, who I'd met, once, and saying, just wanted to let you know, I've started hormones today. Hope to see you sometime. Bye.
I'm trying to figure out where to go from here. There's so many different places. Let's just unbury the lead here. Did you ever go back and meet with that therapist?
No.
Awesome.
No. I ended up being taken in by somebody in California at the end of this journey. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And how long did you live out here?
That time I was in California for about 7 months before I started another little journey. But in that time, I had the support of a friend who gave me a place to stay and sort of took care of me for a while. and they got me, to go and see a proper doctor. It turned out to be a nice older lady, Dr. Snow, in Berkeley, California, that we went up to, who got me on a proper prescription basis and started to add progesterone. They were a little bit aggressive back in the 90s, tended to start with fairly high doses.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, again, so many places to go. Let's go here, because I don't get to ask a lot of people this. We don't generally get to interview a lot of people that have transitioned. Forgive this term, but so long ago. We tend to think nowadays, those of us that are transitioning now and in this, that it was much harder back then, because as we grew up, we didn't even have the language. There was a lot of negative publicity. There were negative portrayals in movies and on TV. So the perception that we have is that it was much harder and much less accepted. From your perspective and what you might know about what's going on now as a big advocate for the community, do you feel that that's really true?
I mean, we benefited from the fact that nobody was looking for us. I'll be quite honest, when I self-accepted back in 1992, I didn't come out as trans. I was aware of the term at that point, but I said, I'm female, and that was my identity. So as far as I was concerned, I was a girl. And, if the world didn't accept it, that was their problem. And I think that confidence put me in a position where I didn't really worry about it that much. It was certainly boosted by my time in that surgery center, because like many trans people, when you start, this is my story, but when you start, you feel like, oh, I'll never pass, right? If passing was the goal, I'll never pass. People will always know. And to my shock, again, not being on hormones or anything at this point, there was a pair of grandparents who this is one of the youngest people that I ever met during this period. This was an 18-year-old having surgery. Parents had rejected them, but the grandparents were there and taking care of them. And I casually dropped the fact that, I had such a great experience. I was planning to come there for my surgery, and they were sort of looking at me as like, what surgery? And I said, well, when it's my turn. And they're like, oh, we didn't realize that you were trans. So, I mean, that was a huge boost, obviously. That was, I think, the same day that I got, the hormones. And I was on a high that day, very much so. But it gave me the confidence to just be and not worry about things. And I'll be honest, I never felt in danger at all. A little nervous sometimes on buses, but I was more nervous traveling around the South before I had transitioned than I was when I was traveling, afterwards.
Wow, that's so interesting. Aren't those accidental affirmations just so wonderful, where people just, slip it in and you're like, wow, really? That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it framed the first couple of years for me. Things didn't always stay that well, but, it gave me that confidence initially.
Well, you bring up a very interesting perspective on the fact that you knew you identified as a woman straight off. And so transgender wasn't really a term that you applied to yourself. And I kind of wonder about that. I wonder if that term transgender and the ability to demonize that these days is sort of one of the big hindrances that we're running up against. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's quite that black and white. I mean, the term, so I did, when it was people who knew, I used the term that we used at the time, which was transsexual, which is not a term I would use today, because it really puts the focus on surgical transition, which is not something that anybody should really be focused on if it's not for you and about you. Transgender was a term, but we didn't use it that much back then. And so when I sort of re-engaged with the community and that had become the umbrella term, it doesn't have to necessarily be an identity. That doesn't mean it can't be part of your identity. So if you were to say, well, what's your gender identity? I'd say it's female. Not trans woman, not trans female, it's female. But I believe that I am transgender because that's my history, that's my medical status. And that's sort of where, the medical community is moving towards. Being transgender is a status. It can be your identity. There's nothing wrong with that if that's how you want to. Many people are really proud about that. That's a big part of their self-confidence and their pride. But for others, maybe not so much. And that's why we don't apply labels to others. All labels are chosen by the individual.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting to me because the term woman or female are terms, those are things that I struggle to identify myself as. And I think it comes down to societal norms and, the ideal. Since I'm not passing enough and I didn't grow up learning all of the mannerisms and having all that beaten into me, I don't feel in a lot of ways that I fit what it means to be a woman. And so I struggle to identify myself with that term. But I kind of wonder, based on what you said, if that would be extremely helpful to a lot of us to just say, no, I am a woman and this is, or for our trans masculine siblings, I'm a man. If that would really kind of help with the journey and our acceptance of ourselves.
I mean, I think that's possibly true. Again, that has to be how you see yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And not all of us do. Of course, we've had this explosion of genderqueer, non-binary identities in the last few years, at least people willing to express themselves that way. It really depends. I've known many people who transitioned later in life, and I'm very familiar with the fact that, for some, we're conditioned basically from the time we exit the womb. We are conditioned a certain way. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying, everybody's transition journey is unique to them. There's no one transition method or what age or whatever that's better than another. But once I started to become introverted, which is something, that happened sort of in early childhood, the conditioning didn't take that strongly for me. So when I took those 2 years to sort of let go of it, I mean, that was a blessing for my particular journey, but I lost a lot of other things too. The day I transitioned, I literally couldn't remember the previous 20 years of my life. It just went blank overnight. And I slowly started to pull back, memories would return and I would start to integrate them back after that fact. But it was a bit of a shock. I hadn't intended for that to happen. I don't think that we are required to emulate, binary cis normative behavior if that doesn't work for us. I do know that a lot of people would like to do that and not be judged the way that a society judges. And I think ultimately it comes down to treating people the way they want to be treated, seeing them the way they want to be seen, regardless of the way they look or the conditioning they've had or how they behave. But it's not just other people. There's a journey inside us of self-acceptance that has to happen, and that takes time. Transition isn't a set period. It doesn't mean, if you decide to do medical and perhaps surgical transition, that you reach a point where you're done. I mean, yes, to a sense, you're done with primary transition, the act of transitioning, but it's a lifelong thing. And, we're hopefully constantly growing and learning more about ourselves. And I've had a lot of time to do that.
As you've moved along in your journey, did you have a roadmap to start? Have your goals shifted as you've gone along? Like, for example, did you have certain surgeries in mind that you would or would not do that as you moved in and kind of got to a certain point, you're like, okay, yeah, that is for me or that isn't for me, that, like I said, wasn't the way you set out initially?
There, in that early online community, there was sort of already a roadmap of this is what you do. Mm-hmm. From a very young age, even though I didn't necessarily know that it was something that I had to do, I had a very different relationship to my body. And so surgery was always the end goal for me, bottom surgery specifically. I needed that in order to feel whole. Mm-hmm. And so that was the goal that I was aiming for. But to be perfectly honest, I came out to this country and started this sort of journey within journeys without expecting to succeed. There was no insurance coverage back there. Surgery was very expensive. And we did mention briefly, international trade. It made my parents' finances were stretched pretty thin. So I knew that they couldn't afford it. And certainly I was not allowed to work. I was effectively either a student or a tourist, so I could have no income legally. And I didn't want to risk, the consequences of doing anything illegal, because that could have resulted in, 10-year and minimum expulsion from the country. And that would have killed me back then. So it was really just, get on hormones, do, medical transition, and see how far you go before, you die.
Mhm.
Because that was my alternative at 20. Is like, I am so empty. I'm such an empty shell right now that I've got nothing to lose. I can't go on living this way. I can't go on being this way. I can't be with anybody else unless I can be authentic. And I can't be authentic unless I accept this and do whatever I can to, fulfill that identity.
So when were you able to then finally get some of those medical steps towards being whole and feeling like you were in the body you were meant to be?
Well, that was a bit of a surprise. As I said, I was in California for a while. And the people I was staying with were a little bit controversial. And so after a birthday trip the next year out to visit some friends in Washington, D.C., they were like, "You should come stay with us. You should come stay with us." And my friend in California was like, "Yeah, I could definitely, not have the need to support you anymore. So that's good." So I ended up moving to DC for a while. And I had some amazing experiences there, but they weren't really in a position to actually take care of me. I literally had nothing to do during the day, and it was rough. And my status meant that I could enter and leave and enter the U.S. as many times as I want, but I could only stay for 6 months at a time. And so I had to go. I had to go and spend some time in Canada every 6 months. I'd done it on the West Coast the year before, and I was due. So my then boyfriend drove me up to Toronto and then over to Montreal. And while I was up there, I visited with one of the other North American surgeons who was based in Montreal. And then we returned. I'd done this before. I figured this would go well. They wouldn't let me into the country. I was denied entry, and literally my world ended because I had the clothes on my back. My boyfriend had to get back to, DC for work, and I literally didn't know what I was going to do. I did have a return ticket. That's something that you have to have. You have to be able to return to your country of origin when you're a tourist, or technically in tourist status. But it was out of Miami, and so I basically just sat there in the immigration office and it's like, well, shit. What do I do now? Maybe I can call my parents and they can find a way to, get me a room for the night or something. I honestly consider this as a miracle, but after some time sitting there and sort of dealing with my boyfriend's panic about, I have to go, they pulled me up and said, "We've changed our minds. You can go through." Needless to say, that experience was very stressful. And I literally couldn't stop shaking for the next 2 hours. And I broke up with my boyfriend on the interstate on the way back. And it didn't go well.
Was that sparked primarily by the fact that he was going to abandon you, or was there a lot other going on behind there?
It was the stress. I mean, we were both pretty young. I think it was the stress. He didn't really understand what I was going through, and I kind of flipped out on him. But then our car died. So we got to spend the night, in the dark with no power, have semis whizzing by until somebody found us and took us to a repair station, and we were stuck there a day. But when I got back, I thought, okay, I need to do something. I need to get out of here. And it just so happened that some of my friends from before, the cis friends that I've met, in online communities, were having a convention in Chicago. And I had a friend, I had to twist an arm a little bit because she had initially said she would buy me a plane ticket there. And then she was like, "I'm not so sure." And I'm like, "I got to get out of here." So I flew to Chicago. I had one of the best weekends of my life when, I was completely in my element at that point, completely possible, and nobody knew. And they just treated me like, any other girl. And it was amazing. I ended up going home with some of them to Las Vegas.
Oh, the twists and turns in this story are crazy. Wow. Okay.
I actually dated the guy I went home with. There was a whole bunch of them, but he was this person who owned the house for 2 weeks. He then dumped me for 2 weeks. That was hell. Then we became friends again. And in that brief 6 weeks period, I got this call from my parents and they said, we're going to pay for your surgery. So that's how that happened. I eventually ended up back in California. I actually ended up working through some very strange loopholes. I was able to do some consulting work. And just before my 24th birthday, I ended up back in that surgery center in Neenah, Wisconsin. And I had bottom surgery with Dr. Eugene Schrang, who has since retired. He was a very German doctor, very particular, preferred his patients unconscious.
Wow. It's just so easy for your head to spin from a story like that because of if you had a map out and you're trying to draw that, like even that would be tiresome, let alone all of the different twists and turns and that. Wow. I've known you a very brief time, and I know you to be a very, very strong person and a very active. You're doing a ton of different things, and it's just like you have been through the paces. I get how you're as tough as you are these days.
I wasn't nearly as tough back then. I'll say that much. And honestly, at that point in my life, I thought, well, I've done it. Now I've got the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
But some things happened, and there were problems.
Did that period of time for you, going through all of that, at least prove to you that you were resilient and could make it through anything that life threw at you?
I don't think I was there yet, because what came next really sort of messed me up, although it took a while. Mm-hmm. And, I'm willing to talk about it, but I just want to warn everybody that this is kind of a downer. But I discovered that my parents both came out to be with me for my surgery. And I discovered that my mother was not cleared to fly. She was really sick. She had been sick a couple of times during my life. She had these benign tumors that initially would grow in her brain. And so she had brain surgery. She wasn't supposed to survive when I was 4 years old, and she did survive. And it occurred when I was 16 and led to me being in a very dark depression for that year. When she told me that she was probably going to die and I needed to be prepared for that. But it had recurred while all of this was going on, this time in her spine. And on her return flight, which you usually flew through London because it was a very long direct flight, and so flying through London was easier, she went into a coma. They pulled her off the plane, and a very bright young surgeon in the UK said, well, I think I can potentially do this experimental surgery. And she went into surgery and she never woke up after that. So, some 3 months after I had surgery, my mother was in a permanent coma, and my dad eventually got her back to South Africa and into a clinic, and 10 days later she died.
I'm so sorry to hear that. Did you, when she came out for your surgery, did you get a lot of really meaningful interaction?
Some, but I've always regretted not enough. And in fact, her illness was affecting her, and she would get very confused. Mm. And I'd gotten used to living alone. Now I was in a studio apartment with my parents, who I hadn't seen in 2 years. And so some of our interactions were not that great. Mm-hmm. And, for being so supportive, there was one thing she said while I was recovering from surgery that really threw me, which was, I'll support you forever, but I'll never accept this. And I still to this day don't know how to take that. We got to speak briefly between the period that she was off the plane and before she had surgery. And it was a very difficult conversation because half the time she didn't know where she was.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the last time we spoke. So very mixed feelings.
Yeah.
And, a lot of, for a long time, a lot of guilt.
Yeah.
She made the decision to fly. I believe it was against medical advice, but my dad was unaware and I didn't know that for sure. And I honestly think she felt like she'd done everything she could for me. And so she was able to, move on and not be in pain anymore.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you did have some time with her right there at the end. But the fact that it left you in such a place of doubt and kind of second guessing things, I'm really sorry for that.
Well, it was a long time ago, but thank you. And
What?
I'll be honest, it didn't hit me for a while. I really was completely numb when I got the news.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially with the way it ended, kind of leaving you with those mixed feelings about the level of support and what that meant and what your relationship was going to be going forward. We didn't talk much about your father when you came out to him. How was his level of acceptance through all of this?
Well, I have to give you a little bit of context here. As I said, from a fairly young age, I started to be very introverted. I was a very, very outgoing kid. Um, I first knew I was different from my earliest memories, which were about the age of 3. And this is not uncommon. A lot of trans people have this experience. I didn't really know why I was different, but I knew that I was behaving in ways and doing things that I shouldn't. And so I tried to stop. But by the age of 6, I was pretty clear that I was doing things that were not acceptable for then a little boy. And that's when I sort of went inside myself and sort of lived an internal identity rather than an external one, and avoided anything remotely feminine. That was my solution to that problem. But at the same time, I grew very estranged from my father, and we were not close. When I was in my turned 20, 21, he actually was going through a midlife crisis, and he college and preparing to leave, and we had some very, very fierce arguments. So we had become estranged by that point, which is why there's no way we were going to tell him. My mom actually almost threw him out of the house. I think he did go live apart for a while during the end of all of that. When she did tell him, he was like, "No, this is not real. This isn't a thing." And she's like, "No, we've just had the consultation, and the psychologist says this is real. This is real." He took that in stride, and the first thing he did was go out to a library and find a book about a trans person. And he happened to pick one. My dad's a New Zealander. He's lived in South Africa my entire life, but he grew up in New Zealand, and he met my mom on a tour around the world. He only got halfway though, and I happened. But he read a story about one of the first trans women to become a mayor, and it happened to be in New Zealand, and found that story very enlightening. I have never read that biography, so I don't know what was in it, but it helped him sort of understand. And when I finally got to see him again, when he came out with my mom for the surgery, first time he'd ever been to the States, things were tense, but they were not hostile. And after my mother passed, we were actually able to get a lot closer, and we speak roughly every week now. He's still back there in South Africa, but we use one of the various platforms to. I think we use like video on Messenger or something, because that's what he understands.
Well, that's so beautiful that you were able to reconnect with him and to build that relationship.
It took time, but yeah, we're pretty close now. And for everything that I've been through, the one thing that I did have was that my parents loved me. I mean, we didn't always get on very well, especially during my teens, but I have no doubt about that.
You can get through so much in life knowing that you have that love, that rock at all times.
Yeah.
So, we've talked about so many things. You survived so many things, and I'm sure there was a lot of stuff through all of that you were afraid of. But in terms specifically of your gender transition, throughout the whole bit of it, what were some of the key fears that you ran into, and how did you overcome those?
Well, it's interesting. As I said, once I figured out that people just saw me as a woman and, I didn't really have to worry about that, I was very confident. But strangely enough, a few months after surgery, I started to have experiences that, to this day, I'm not sure if I was overreacting, but I was suddenly very insecure. And I thought I was being misgendered all the time. And I was not prepared for that. I was not prepared for that. And my confidence started to wane. And a number of factors, I got married a few years later to somebody who I thought was a certain person, and it turned out they were not. I went through a very long period of gaslighting and emotional abuse, and it wasn't just one way. It was a dysfunctional relationship. But by the end of it, I had lost my sense of self. And I was incredibly unhealthy. I developed a debilitating acute fibromyalgia condition that essentially, rendered me barely functional. And I had put on a lot of weight, and I lost myself in that process. And it all sort of stemmed from those first encounters of, and again, they might have been in my mind, but just people not seeing me for who I was. It was just this long, long spiral, which lasted about 15 years. So, after all of that initial success, I actually hit rock bottom. Sorry, getting confused. Rock bottom. There we go. Words. But it was after that that we moved to Pittsburgh, and the story changed again.
Mm-hmm. At that time, when you're kind of worried about how people are seeing you, I'm assuming that with that kind of comes some dysphoria about your appearance and things like that. What were some of the things that you did particularly then, or have found since then, to validate yourself as a woman in your identity?
Well, I can't say a lot of positive things about then, because then I literally stopped seeing myself as anything. I kept doing my job. I kept existing, but I wasn't really living at that point. And I didn't really see myself that way when, it all sort of came to a head. I think just sort of rediscovering myself was the first thing that happened when I got to Pittsburgh. And it was sort of that journey to rebuild myself that led to the work that I do today. And it was a piece by piece. First I worked on my health and my weight, and then I started to see myself again. And I just built on top of that and on top of that, and my confidence returned. And again, I ran into that situation where, I was, it's kind of crazy, but we were living with my in-laws, and I was not out to them for 2 years. Supposed to be 2 weeks, but it was 2 years. And I've never come out to them. I don't know if they ever suspected or whatever, but I never did that. And so I realized that regardless of how I felt about myself, I was still perceived correctly as a woman. And so it was there, I didn't have to think about it too much, but I didn't feel particularly attractive. I didn't feel seen. I felt really invisible, coming sort of back to myself in my late 30s. And it was only when I sort of reached out and started interacting with and working with and advocating with the trans community again, or the LGBT community in general, mentoring other people in their transitions, that I started to feel whole again. And all of that initial confidence came back just like that. Once I was healthy, once I was whole as a person, it was just there because that's who I was.
Mm-hmm. Now, something that I had kind of forgotten to circle back around to before, and I just kind of wanted to hit on this real quick, if you're willing to talk about it. You had mentioned that your mom had asked, well, what if you fall for a woman? And then you mentioned shortly after in your journey around the United States that you were dating men. Were you identifying as gay previously to that, or how did the dating, who you chose to date, kind of coincide with your gender exploration?
That's interesting because I learned a great deal about that as it was happening. Um, Growing up, I was attracted to girls. I always thought that, that was the relationship I should be at. I had absolutely no interest in boys whatsoever. So, me thinking I'm doing a really great job of hiding everything in myself. When somebody asked me, at the age of 12 if I was gay, I was pretty confident that I knew I was not gay. Um, when I accepted myself, even before, I started on the transition journey, that sort of, there was this moment where I said, this is it. And everything changed after that moment. I suddenly discovered that I was quite attracted to guys. And I liked the way they treated me. But, all of this is happening. What we haven't talked about is that I actually transitioned virtually before I transitioned in real life. I actually went through a transition with my friends in these virtual communities, all text-based back then. It was sort of like a trial run, if you will. And I noticed how people responded to me. And that just opened up a whole new world for me. And I actually, it kind of, there was initially a period where I was more or less exploring bisexuality, and then it kind of just flipped completely. And so here I was sort of thinking I was a heterosexual male, and I ended up being a heterosexual female, which was unexpected, completely unexpected. And so the people I dated and the people I sort of were looking to be in relationships with were all men. Although I did, have, I wouldn't call them romantic, but intimate relations with several other trans people along the way.
Mm.
I was very close to a number of people. Deep down, though, I think I knew that I had bi tendencies, and this, coming full circle, because you know this, but your viewers don't. I'm currently engaged to another woman, so I realized that at some point I don't identify as pansexual. I do identify as bisexual, but it really comes down to who the person is more than what their physicality or identity is.
Mm-hmm.
That said, it's not without its challenges, because I do still get really attracted to men. It's just, that's not who I've chosen as a life partner.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that, I think that's a really kind of fascinating part of the journey for a lot of us as trans people. One of the things that kind of surprised me looking to actually medically transition is that I wasn't afraid of my interests changing from women to men. That was something that didn't stop me in any way, and that simple fact kind of put me back on my heels a little bit. Like that's an interesting thought, that I'm not afraid of that at all. And then here I am about a year and a half into HRT, and all of a sudden I just feel like I'm finding guys that I'm attracted to, and so it's just you're kind of never sure how it's going to go sometimes, and it'll surprise you.
We used to have a sort of a conventional wisdom, and I think it still holds true. It's like, don't make any bets on your orientation during transition. You have no idea how it's going to turn out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very good advice. Let's see. We're running towards the end of the segment here. Time, as I promised, has flown by pretty good. Let's go ahead and start hitting on the key questions that we end with. Actually, there's my first question I like to start with. I jumped across to get right into your journey. So let's go to that one first. My favorite question of the night: how did you choose your name?
Yes. So I think, choosing a name is a very personal thing. There are a lot of ways to do it. I know a lot of people who choose something completely different from what they were raised as. I know some people who actually work with their parents to find out what they would have been named if they had been born into the correct, assignment. My name ultimately found me. I had a name that I was using in those virtual spaces. And so when I first came to the US, that's how everybody knew me. And that name was Jess. Everybody called me Jess. But it was sometime when I was living with those folks in that apartment on their couch in Florida where I happened to run across the name that I use now, Alicyn. And something about it just caught me. And there's a lot of symbolism and sentimentality associated with it. The two closest people in my life were my mother and my grandmother, which, has kind of been implied up to this point. And they both had the same names. They were both Alison Mary, Alison spelt in the English style, Alison. And my mom went by her middle name. And I thought that at that point, my mom was still with us, but I thought that is something that links me to them and can be seen as a sort of a connection to that family. And then I sort of, I saw the name and I looked into it and I learned the origins. It's a very rare English name and it's a fusion. It's a fusion name of Alice and Cynthia. And I looked up the meanings of those particular names and I'm like, oh yeah, this works. And so, Alice tends to mean noble, of spirit or whatever. I don't know. And Cynthia is another name for Diana, the moon goddess. And so it's sort of like noble goddess of the moon is what you could translate my name to. And that just really appealed because I've always had a, connection to the night sky and to the moon. And it just felt right. And I'd always had sort of a sense for my, I have a middle name as well. And I'd kind of always known what it should sound like, but I hadn't really figured out what it should be spelled. And so I knew it started with a C and it just sort of evolved. Ultimately, I chose my middle name, Kathleen, because it evoked my connection to Celtic roots, which I wasn't even fully sure that I had. I have a strong affinity for Ireland, but it turns out that through my father, I'm actually, my ancestors were Scottish. But that was something I learned many years later. It felt like it belonged to me, and that's how I chose those names.
What a beautiful way to choose a name. I love that you got to sort of do all of the things. You got to choose something completely new, and you got to pay homage and tie into your family and your family, your immediate family heritage, and look into the heritage of the names themselves and come up with something that had such a deep meaning, not only to the name but to you as well. It's very beautiful.
Thank you. I like it a lot.
Yeah. What are some of the things that you feel you've been able to accomplish in your life because of your transition?
Well, I can tell you right now, I would never have been in a relationship if it wasn't for this. I don't think I would have survived, to be perfectly honest. At the time I was sort of dealing with this in my 20s, I could not see a future, A, without being with other people, and B, just existing in the shell of an identity that I had left to me. I suppressed my identity from the age of 17 until 20. And one of the revelations that led to that sort of catalyst moment was that when I suppressed my feminine identity, there wasn't anything left. It was just really, really empty. And so I did not see a way forward. It was either suicide, to be perfectly blunt, or transition. And once those were my options, whatever happened next was, I had nothing left to lose. But it has taught me a lot. I mean, I had some amazing, as you now know, experiences that I learned a lot from. I got to see and do things that not many people in my position have, meet some great people. Unfortunately, over time, I lost a lot of those connections. They didn't persist. Mm-hmm. Until I was, settled in California many years later. But I would not be the person I am if not for all of these experiences, good or bad. And all of those experiences, my journey and all of the people that I've met and their journeys and all of the trans people I've met and their journeys inform what I do now, inform the direction that my life has taken and the work that I do. So I would not be doing this work if it weren't for that. Mm-hmm. So I'm very grateful.
Yeah, that's sort of an easy question for you. What have you been able to accomplish because of your journey? Well, everything. Do you have a favorite thing that you've learned through your journey, whether it's about yourself or the world around us?
Well, something that we all know very well is resilience. I've learned that unfortunately I'm very resilient. So it means that I keep going despite how awful it is. I really wish we didn't, as a community, have to have those experiences, but it's fairly common. Um, the last 10 years, rebuilding myself after a very dark period, I've learned essentially that the biggest obstacle in life is one's own fear of what might happen. And if you can learn that and identify that and control that, you can do pretty much anything that you want to. I've built an entire career just out of literally nothing twice in my life now. The first one didn't end very well for me, but everything that I've done is really just about me as a person. I'm the product that I sell, which means any failures or any issues, it's me. I'm the problem. So it's double edged. But yeah, basically that if you have the will and intent and you're willing to step past your own fears, you really can achieve almost anything.
And then I think that dovetails really nicely into the next question. But what advice do you have to pass on to young or closeted trans folks out there?
It's a tough time to be giving advice to trans folks. Um, we talked about this briefly earlier, but I honestly feel like with the way that our community is being targeted right now, it's never been this bad before. Nobody really cared in the past when I was transitioning because we just weren't that visible. But I think you've got to do it because there is no substitute for living your authentic life, being your authentic self. And regardless of the challenges, you cannot, in my mind, be completely whole unless you fully accept yourself, whatever that may mean for you. I mean, there are countless ways to be trans, or countless ways to be gender diverse, which is another term we use a lot. You don't have to follow anyone else's journey. You don't have to be like anybody else, but you do, I think, ultimately need to be true to yourself, or, you're just holding yourself back. You're making yourself miserable. That said, it's very risky to come out in some parts of this country, and there are a lot of challenges that previous generations didn't have to face with the increased visibility. So while I think you should be true to yourself, you also need to be safe. And those are the things that I think everybody has to balance out. But know that there are a lot of us, a lot of people who have this lived experience working really, really hard to improve things for everybody else through education, through pushing back against misinformation that has been weaponized against us. There are more people in our community doing this good work than ever before. And we're doing it for ourselves and we're doing it for you, whether you're young or old, who come to this come to realize that this is your part of who you are at whatever stage of life.
Thank you so much for that advice. And Alison, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story. What a journey you've been through. I'm so glad that you got to experience those things, you made it through it, and you were here to share all that with us tonight.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to have had the opportunity.